The desert wind cut through the morning air like a blade, carrying with it the scent of sand and diesel fuel. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos adjusted her medical pack one more time, checking the straps that had loosened during the long ride to Forward Operating Base Bravo. Around her, 47 Marines prepared for what intelligence had labeled a routine extraction mission. The irony wasn't lost on her that nothing in Afghanistan had ever been routine. Maria had heard the whispers before they even reached the landing zone. The same words that had followed her through 18 months of deployment, echoing in the mess halls and during briefings. Dead weight, liability, should have stayed stateside. The comments stung more than the desert sun beating down on her Kevlar helmet, but she had learned to push them aside. Today, like every other day, she would prove them wrong through actions rather than words. The Black Hawk helicopter squatted on the makeshift helipad like a giant metal insect, its rotors already beginning their lazy warm-up rotation. Captain Rodriguez, the mission commander, gathered his team around the aircraft for final instructions. His voice carried over the increasing noise of the engines as he outlined their objective: extract a wounded Afghan interpreter from a village 12 miles northeast of their position. Intelligence suggests minimal hostile activity in the area, Rodriguez shouted, his words nearly lost in the mechanical thunder. We go in fast, grab our guy, and get out. Santos, you'll handle medical stabilization once we locate the target. Maria nodded, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settle across her shoulders. Despite the constant criticism from her fellow Marines, she had never failed to complete a mission. Her medical training had saved dozens of lives during her deployment, yet somehow the respect she deserved remained elusive. Perhaps it was because she stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall in her combat boots, or maybe it was because she had joined the Marines after working as a civilian nurse for 6 years. Whatever the reason, Maria had grown accustomed to being underestimated. The helicopter lifted off with a mechanical roar that drowned out all conversation. Maria found herself pressed against the metal wall of the aircraft, surrounded by Marines who avoided eye contact. Corporal Jenkins sat directly across from her, his face twisted into the perpetual sneer he reserved specifically for her presence. Next to him, Private First Class Morrison cleaned his rifle with methodical precision, occasionally glancing in her direction with undisguised contempt. Hope we don't run into anything serious out there, Jenkins muttered to Morrison, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. Wouldn't want our medic to freeze up when things get real. Morrison chuckled, the sound harsh and cutting. Maybe she'll surprise us and actually be useful for once. Maria pretended not to hear the comments, instead focusing on the landscape rolling beneath them. The Afghan countryside stretched endlessly in all directions, a patchwork of brown earth, scattered vegetation, and ancient stone structures that had witnessed centuries of conflict. She had learned to find beauty in this harsh land, even as it tried daily to kill her and her fellow Marines. The village appeared ahead of them like a cluster of mud brick cubes scattered across the desert floor. Thin streams of smoke rose from cooking fires, and Maria could see figures moving between the buildings like ants. The pilot's voice crackled through the headsets, announcing their approach to the landing zone. 2 minutes to touchdown, the pilot announced. Weather's holding steady, but we've got some wind gusts from the southeast. Captain Rodriguez checked his watch and surveyed his team one final time. Remember, this is supposed to be a friendly extraction. Keep your weapons ready, but don't go looking for trouble. Santos, stay close to me once we're on the ground. The helicopter descended rapidly, kicking up clouds of dust that obscured everything beyond the aircraft's immediate vicinity. Maria felt her stomach drop as they touched down with a heavy thud that jarred every bone in her body. The rear ramp lowered with a hydraulic whine, and suddenly, the interior of the aircraft was filled with swirling sand and the acrid smell of the desert. The Marines moved out with practiced efficiency, establishing a defensive perimeter around the landing zone while the helicopter's engines continued their steady idle. Maria followed Captain Rodriguez toward the village center, her medical pack bouncing against her back with each step. The weight of the equipment felt reassuring, a tangible reminder of her purpose and training. The village seemed strangely quiet as they approached the first buildings. A few children peered at them from doorways before disappearing back into the shadows. An elderly man emerged from one of the structures, gesturing frantically toward a building at the far end of the settlement. His words came in rapid Pashto, but his meaning was clear enough. "That's our guy," Rodriguez said, pointing toward the building the old man had indicated. "Let's move." They found the interpreter, Ahmad, lying on a makeshift bed inside a small room that smelled of incense and fear. A crude bandage covered his left shoulder, dark with dry blood that indicated he had been wounded at least 12 hours earlier. His eyes were bright with fever, and Maria immediately recognized the signs of infection setting in. "Can you move him?" Rodriguez asked as Maria knelt beside the wounded man. She quickly assessed Ahmed's condition, checking his pulse and examining the wound beneath the bandage. The bullet had passed clean through his shoulder, missing major arteries but creating significant tissue damage. Without proper medical treatment, infection would likely prove fatal within days. "He needs immediate surgery," Maria replied, already preparing in 4-line. "I can stabilize him for transport, but we need to get him to a field hospital as soon as possible." As she worked, Maria could hear the Marines outside, maintaining their security perimeter. Everything seemed to be proceeding according to plan. Ahmad was conscious enough to communicate, and within minutes, she had him ready for evacuation. They lifted him onto a stretcher and began moving back toward the landing zone. The first indication of trouble came as a sharp crack that echoed off the village walls. Captain Rodriguez immediately dropped to one knee, raising his hand to halt the patrol. "Contact," he whispered into his radio. "Single shot, direction unknown." More shots followed in rapid succession, the distinctive crack of AK-47 rifles mixed with the deeper boom of RPGs. The Marines scattered for cover as bullets began striking the walls around them. Maria found herself crouched behind a low stone wall, still gripping one end of Ahmed's stretcher as chaos erupted around her. "We need to get back to the bird," Rodriguez shouted over the gunfire. "They're between us and the LZ." Through the dust and confusion, Maria could see muzzle flashes coming from several buildings surrounding the village center. The Taliban had waited until the Marines were committed to the extraction before launching their attack. It was a textbook ambush, and they were caught in the middle of it. The radio crackled with urgent voices as the Marines tried to coordinate their response. "Bird Dog 6, this is Talon 2. We are taking effective fire from multiple positions. Request immediate close air support." "Talon 2, Bird Dog 6. Air support is 20 minutes out. Can you hold your position?" 20 minutes might as well have been 20 hours. The Taliban fighters had them pinned down in the village center with limited cover and no clear route back to the helicopter. Worse yet, Maria could see that several Marines had already been wounded in the initial assault. Corporal Jenkins lay motionless behind a pile of rubble, blood pooling beneath his head. Private Morrison was clutching his leg and calling for medical assistance. 2 other Marines had taken positions behind a damaged vehicle, returning fire toward the enemy positions, but their ammunition wouldn't last forever. "Santos, get to Morrison," Rodriguez ordered. "Jenkins looks Kia." Maria low-crawled across the open ground between her position and the wounded private, dragging her medical pack behind her. Bullets whined overhead, some striking so close that she could feel the displaced air. Morrison's leg wound was serious but not immediately life-threatening, and she quickly applied a pressure bandage while he continued firing his rifle. "How bad is it, Doc?" Morrison asked through gritted teeth. "You'll live to complain about the food in the mess hall," Maria replied, already moving toward the next casualty. The battle continued to rage around them as Maria worked her way from one wounded Marine to another. Despite the constant danger, she felt a strange sense of calm descending over her. This was what she had trained for, what she was meant to do. The critical comments and skeptical looks from her fellow Marines seemed insignificant compared to the immediate need to save lives. Captain Rodriguez appeared beside her as she finished treating a Marine with shrapnel wounds to his arm. "We can't stay here much longer," he said. "They're maneuvering to cut off our retreat entirely." "How many wounded?" Maria asked, wiping sweat and dust from her face. "4 so far, plus our interpreter. Can they be moved?" Maria glanced around at her patients. Morrison could walk with assistance, and the others were stable enough for evacuation if they moved quickly. Give me 2 minutes to get them ready for transport. Those 2 minutes stretched into eternity as the Taliban fighters pressed their attack. The sound of automatic weapons fire grew closer, and Maria could hear Rodriguez coordinating with the helicopter crew over the radio. The pilot was reporting that the landing zone was taking fire, but he was maintaining his position. Talon 2, this is Dustoff 77. I'm taking rounds near the LZ, but I'm not leaving without you. The determination in the pilot's voice gave Maria hope, even as the situation continued to deteriorate around them. She had just finished preparing the wounded Marines for movement when the world exploded in a thunderous roar that shook the ground beneath her feet. An RPG had struck the building directly behind their position, sending chunks of stone and metal flying through the air like deadly rain. Maria felt something strike her helmet hard enough to snap her head back, and for a moment her vision went dark around the edges. When her sight cleared, she realized that several more Marines had been wounded in the explosion. Multiple casualties, Rodriguez called in his radio. We need immediate evacuation. But as Maria looked toward the landing zone, her heart sank. A thick column of black smoke was rising from the direction of their helicopter. Through the haze and dust, she could see the distinctive silhouette of the Black Hawk, but something was terribly wrong. The aircraft was tilted at an unnatural angle, and she could see flames licking at its fuselage. Dustoff 77, what's your status? Rodriguez demanded. The radio crackled with static before the pilot's voice came through, strained but determined. Talon 2, we've taken an RPG hit to the tail rotor. Aircraft is down, but intact. We're still alive, but we're not going anywhere. The situation had just gone from desperate to impossible. They were stranded in enemy territory with multiple wounded Marines, no air support for 15 more minutes, and their only means of evacuation destroyed. Worse yet, the Taliban fighters would soon realize that the helicopter was disabled and focus their entire assault on the crashed aircraft. Maria looked around at the faces of the Marines surrounding her. For the first time since she had joined their unit, she saw something different in their expressions. The skepticism and contempt had been replaced by something else entirely. They were looking at her not as a liability or deadweight, but as their lifeline in an impossible situation. Captain Rodriguez made the decision that would define the next several hours of their lives. We moved to the helicopter, he announced. Set up a defensive perimeter around the bird and wait for extraction. It was the only choice they had, but Maria knew it would also be the most dangerous few hundred yards any of them had ever traveled. They would have to move 7 wounded Marines across open ground while under fire from an unknown number of enemy fighters. The chances of everyone making it to the helicopter alive were slim at best. But as Maria shouldered her medical pack and helped lift Ahmed's stretcher, she felt something she hadn't experienced since arriving in Afghanistan. For the first time in 18 months, she knew without doubt that her fellow Marines were counting on her not just to do her job, but to help lead them through the crisis ahead. The journey to the helicopter would test every skill she had learned and every ounce of courage she possessed. But Maria Santos was ready for the challenge. Even if she didn't yet realize that the next few hours would transform her from an outcast into a hero, and prove once and for all that sometimes the person everyone underestimates turns out to be exactly the person everyone needs. The 300 yards between their current position and the downed helicopter stretched ahead like an endless nightmare. Maria could see the Black Hawk clearly now, its tail section twisted and smoking, the main rotor blades drooping like broken wings. Somehow, the fact that she could see their destination made the distance seem even more impossible to cross. Captain Rodriguez gathered his remaining able-bodied Marines for a quick briefing. We move in 2 teams, he explained, his voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. First team provides covering fire while the second team moves the wounded. Santos, you coordinate medical evacuation of all casualties. Maria nodded, mentally calculating the logistics of moving 7 wounded men across open terrain under fire. Ahmad was unconscious, but stable. Morrison could walk with assistance, and the others fell somewhere between those 2 extremes. She would need help, and she would need Marines willing to expose themselves to enemy fire to carry stretchers. "I'll need volunteers to help with the wounded," she announced, looking around at the faces of the Marines. Without hesitation, 3 men stepped forward, including Private Morrison despite his own leg wound. "I can still carry," Morrison said simply. "Doc took care of me. I take care of the others." The transformation in Morrison's attitude was so complete that Maria almost didn't recognize him as the same Marine who had been mocking her capabilities just hours earlier. Whatever respect she had earned had been paid for in blood and demonstrated competence under the worst possible conditions. The first team, led by Sergeant Williams, moved out to establish covering positions along their route to the helicopter. Maria watched them sprint from cover to cover, drawing immediate fire from the Taliban positions. The crack of rifles and the deeper thump of machine guns filled the air as the firefight intensified. "Go, go, go," Rodriguez shouted, and Maria found herself running across the open ground with Ahmed's stretcher, Morrison limping alongside her while carrying medical supplies. Behind them, 2 more Marines carried another wounded man, their movements coordinated by months of training and pure adrenaline. The first 20 yards passed in a blur of dust and gunfire. Maria could hear bullets striking the ground around them, some passing close enough that she could feel the air displacement. Her focus narrowed to the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other while maintaining her grip on the stretcher handles. They reached the first piece of cover, a low stone wall that provided minimal protection from the enemy positions. Maria immediately began checking Ahmed's condition while the covering team provided suppressing fire. His pulse was steady but weak, and the 4-line was still functioning properly. "So far, so good." 30 seconds, then we move again, Rodriguez called out. The second sprint was longer and more dangerous. The Taliban fighters had adjusted their aim, and Maria could see dirt fountains erupting all around them as they ran. Halfway across the open space, she heard Morrison grunt in pain and saw him stumble. His wounded leg had given out, but he refused to stop moving. "Keep going," he gasped, still carrying his share of the medical supplies. "Don't stop for me." They reached the next position just as an RPG exploded against a building 50 yards to their left. The concussion wave knocked Maria to her knees, but she immediately scrambled back to her feet and continued treating the wounded. There was no time for fear, no time for anything except the immediate task of keeping her patients alive. The helicopter crew had not been idle during the firefight. As Maria's group approached the crash site, she could see that the pilot and co-pilot had established their own defensive positions around the aircraft. The crew chief was working frantically to clear debris from the helicopter's interior, while the gunner provided covering fire with his door-mounted machine gun. "Dust off 7-7, this is Talon 2, Rodriguez called into his radio. "We're 50 yards out with multiple wounded. Can you accommodate stretchers inside the bird?" "Roger, Talon 2, came the pilot's reply. "We've got space, but the aircraft is not flyable. We're staying put until extraction arrives." The final approach to the helicopter was the most terrifying yet. The Taliban fighters had concentrated their fire on the crash site, turning the area around the Black Hawk into a deadly killing field. Maria could see the crew chief waving them toward the rear of the aircraft, where the loading ramp provided some protection from incoming fire. They made the last sprint in 2 groups. Maria and Morrison carried Ahmad, while 2 other Marines brought a second wounded man. The covering fire from both the helicopter crew and the Marines was intense enough to force the Taliban fighters to keep their heads down, but bullets still cracked through the air around them. The interior of the helicopter was a maze of damaged equipment and scattered supplies. The crew chief had managed to clear enough space for the wounded, and Maria immediately began setting up a makeshift aid station in the relatively protected cargo area. Outside, the sound of gunfire continued as the remaining Marines fought their way to the helicopter. "How many more coming?" the crew chief asked as Maria worked on Ahmad. "4 more wounded, plus 6 able-bodied," she replied, starting in 4 on another Marine who had taken shrapnel to his chest. "We're going to be tight." The crew chief, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, nodded grimly. "We'll make it work. Bird might not fly, but she'll keep us alive until help arrives." The next 20 minutes were the longest of Maria's life. Wave after wave of wounded Marines arrived at the helicopter, each bringing reports of increasing Taliban pressure. The enemy fighters were maneuvering to surround the crash site, and ammunition was running dangerously low among the defending Marines. Captain Rodriguez was the last to arrive, carrying one end of a stretcher containing Corporal Jenkins. Despite Maria's earlier assessment, Jenkins was still alive, though barely. A bullet had grazed his skull, causing massive bleeding but miraculously missing his brain. He was unconscious and would need immediate surgery, but he might survive if they could get him to a field hospital. "That's everyone," Rodriguez announced as they dragged Jenkins into the helicopter. "Now we wait for extraction and try not to get overrun." The helicopter, designed to carry 12 passengers, now held 47 Marines plus the 4-man crew. They were packed together like sardines, with wounded men lying on stretchers while able-bodied Marines crouched in whatever space remained. The air was thick with the smell of blood, sweat, and fear, but Maria had never felt more focused in her life. She moved from patient to patient, monitoring vital signs and adjusting treatments as needed. Morrison's leg wound had reopened during their movement to the helicopter, and she quickly applied a fresh pressure bandage while he insisted he was fine. The Marine with chest shrapnel was developing signs of a pneumothorax, and she had to insert a needle into his chest cavity to relieve the pressure. "How are they looking, Doc?" Captain Rodriguez asked during a brief lull in the fighting outside. "3 critical, for serious. The rest will make it," Maria replied, wiping sweat from her face. "But I need that medevac soon, or I'm going to lose some of them." Rodriguez nodded and keyed his radio. "Bird Dog 6, this is Talon 2. We need immediate medical evacuation for multiple urgent surgical cases." "Talon 2, Bird Dog 6. Medevac is inbound. ETA 15 minutes. Close air support is 5 minutes out." 15 minutes might as well have been 15 hours. Outside the helicopter, Maria could hear the Taliban fighters getting closer. The sound of AK-47 fire was now so close that she could hear the distinctive metallic clatter of the weapons action cycling. The Marines defending the perimeter were running low on ammunition, and everyone inside the helicopter knew that their situation was becoming desperate. The crew chief appeared beside Maria as she worked on Jenkins. "Doc, we might need to move some of the wounded to more defensible positions inside the bird. Taliban's getting close to the perimeter." Maria looked around at her patients. Moving them would risk reopening wounds and disrupting her carefully maintained medical setup, but staying in their current positions might get them all killed if the Taliban overran their defenses. "Give me 2 minutes to stabilize the worst cases," she said, already reaching for additional pressure bandages. As if summoned by her words, the distinctive whine of jet engines suddenly filled the air overhead. The F-16 fighter aircraft arrived like thunderbolts from heaven, unleashing a devastating barrage of cannon fire and precision missiles on the Taliban positions. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The intense enemy fire that had been pouring toward the helicopters suddenly decreased to scattered, ineffective shots. "Close air support is on station," Rodriguez announced with obvious relief. Birds are working over the enemy positions. But Maria knew their respite would be temporary. The fighter aircraft couldn't stay overhead indefinitely, and the Taliban would regroup as soon as the air support departed. They needed that medical evacuation helicopter, and they needed it soon. The sound of approaching rotors reached them just as the F-16s completed their first attack run. Through the dust and smoke, Maria could see 2 UH-60 medevac helicopters approaching the crash site, escorted by a pair of Apache attack helicopters that immediately began engaging the remaining Taliban positions. "Medevac is 2 minutes out," Rodriguez called. "Get ready to move the wounded." Maria's mind raced as she prioritized her patients for evacuation. Jenkins and Ahmad were the most critical, followed by the Marine with chest injuries. The others were stable enough to wait for a second helicopter if necessary. She quickly briefed Morrison and the other volunteers on the evacuation sequence. "We go fast, and we don't stop," she told them. "The medevac birds can't stay on the ground long, so we get our people loaded and get them out of here." The first medevac helicopter touched down in a whirlwind of dust and debris, its crew immediately jumping out to assist with loading the wounded. Maria found herself running alongside Jenkins' stretcher as they moved him from the crashed Black Hawk to the waiting aircraft. The professionalism of the medevac crew was immediately apparent. They had Jenkins loaded and connected to their advanced life support equipment within seconds. "What's his status?" the flight medic shouted over the engine noise. "Closed head injury, possible skull fracture, unconscious for 40 minutes, Maria replied rapidly. "BP stable, pulse strong, but needs immediate neurosurgery." The flight medic nodded and made quick notes on his patient form. "We'll have him at Bagram in 20 minutes. Good work keeping him alive." As the first medevac helicopter lifted off with its cargo of wounded Marines, Maria felt a profound sense of accomplishment. Despite everything that had gone wrong, despite the ambush and the crashed helicopter and the desperate firefight, she had managed to keep all her patients alive long enough to reach advanced medical care. The second medevac helicopter landed before the first had disappeared from view. Ahmad and 2 other wounded Marines were quickly loaded aboard, along with detailed medical reports that Maria had prepared during the wait. As the aircraft departed, she realized that the immediate medical crisis was over. All the seriously wounded had been evacuated, and the remaining Marines could wait for regular transportation back to base. But even as the last medevac helicopter disappeared into the distance, Maria knew that their ordeal was far from over. They were still stranded at the crash site with a disabled helicopter, limited ammunition, and an unknown number of Taliban fighters in the surrounding area. The fighter aircraft overhead provided temporary security, but they couldn't stay forever. Captain Rodriguez gathered his remaining Marines for a situation briefing. "Extraction helicopter is inbound. ETA, 30 minutes. We hold this position until they arrive." Maria looked around at the faces of the Marines surrounding her. Every one of them was looking at her with something she had never seen before: genuine respect and gratitude. Morrison nodded to her as he checked his rifle, his wounded leg forgotten in the adrenaline of combat. Even the Marines who had never spoken to her directly were now treating her as one of their own. The transformation was complete, but Maria Santos didn't yet realize that her greatest test still lay ahead. The 30-minute wait stretched into an hour, then 2 hours. The extraction helicopter had been delayed by mechanical problems, leaving the stranded Marines to hold their increasingly precarious position around the crashed Black Hawk. The Taliban fighters had regrouped despite the earlier airstrikes, and Maria could see movement in the buildings surrounding their perimeter. Captain Rodriguez paced back and forth inside the helicopter, his radio constantly crackling with updates from command. "Bird Dog 6, this is Talon 2. What's the status on our extraction?" "Talon 2, standby. Extraction Bird is dealing with hydraulic issues. Working to get you a backup aircraft." Maria continued to monitor the remaining wounded Marines, though their conditions had stabilized significantly. Morrison's leg wound was holding together well, and the others were in no immediate danger. But she could see the strain beginning to show on everyone's faces as the delay stretched longer and longer. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the crash site, turning the interior of the helicopter into an oven. With 47 Marines packed into a space designed for 12, the heat was becoming dangerous in its own right. Maria began to worry about dehydration and heat exhaustion among the men who had already been through a traumatic firefight. "We need to establish a water distribution schedule," she told Rodriguez during a brief lull in radio traffic. "In this heat, with this many people, we're going to start having heat casualties if we're not careful." Rodriguez nodded, understanding immediately. "Get organized. You're in charge of medical issues." The fact that Rodriguez was now turning to her for leadership decisions spoke volumes about how much her status had changed among the Marines. Just that morning, she had been an outsider they barely tolerated. Now she was being asked to make decisions that could affect the entire unit's survival. Maria quickly organized a rotation system that would allow Marines to move out of the stifling helicopter interior in small groups, taking cover in whatever shade they could find around the crash site. It wasn't much, but it would help prevent heat-related casualties during what was becoming an extended stay in enemy territory. As the third hour passed, The Taliban pressure began to increase noticeably. Sniper fire started coming from new directions, forcing the Marines to constantly adjust their defensive positions. The enemy fighters were probing for weak spots in the perimeter, testing the Marines' response to see where they might be able to break through. They're maneuvering for another assault, Sergeant Williams observed as he crawled back into the helicopter after checking the northern perimeter. I can see at least 15 fighters moving through that cluster of buildings toward 2 o'clock. Rodriguez studied the tactical situation through binoculars, his face grim. They're going to wait until dark, then try to overrun us when we can't get close air support. The implications were clear to everyone. Darkness was only 2 hours away, and fighter aircraft couldn't provide effective support during night operations in such close proximity to friendly forces. Once the sun went down, the Marines would be on their own against an unknown number of Taliban fighters who knew the local terrain perfectly. "What about night vision?" Maria asked, though she already suspected the answer. "We got 4 sets of NVGs for 47 Marines," Rodriguez replied. "Not exactly what you'd call a tactical advantage." Maria looked around at the faces of the Marines surrounding her. Despite the increasing danger, she saw determination rather than despair in their expressions. These men had already proven they could fight against overwhelming odds. The question was whether they could hold out long enough for help to arrive. The radio crackled to life with an update from command. "Talon 2, Bird Dog 6. Backup extraction helicopter is en route. ETA 45 minutes. Be advised, you may be going dark soon." Taliban communications indicate they're planning a major assault at nightfall. Rodriguez acknowledged the transmission and gathered his squad leaders for a quick planning session. 45 minutes puts us right at sunset," he said quietly. "We need to be ready for a coordinated attack." As the Marines prepared their defenses for what could be their final stand, Maria found herself thinking about the events that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had seriously considered requesting a transfer away from this unit due to the constant harassment and lack of acceptance. Now, facing possible death alongside these same Marines, she felt more at home than she ever had in her military career. The irony wasn't lost on her that it had taken a crisis to reveal what she was truly capable of. All the training exercises and routine missions had never provided an opportunity to demonstrate her real value to the unit. It had taken a desperate situation with lives hanging in the balance for her fellow Marines to see past their preconceptions and recognize her as an equal. Morrison appeared beside her as she checked her ammunition for what felt like the 100th time. His leg wound was bothering him more than he wanted to admit, but he had refused her suggestion that he be evacuated with the other wounded. "Doc, I wanted to say something," he began awkwardly. "About before, I mean. About how he treated you." Maria looked at him with surprise. Apologies weren't exactly common in Marine culture, especially from junior enlisted men to NCOs. "You don't need to." "Yeah, I do," Morrison interrupted. "We were wrong. All of us. You've been carrying your weight, and then some, and we were too stupid to see it." Before Maria could respond, the sound of gunfire erupted from the southern perimeter. The Taliban fighters had launched their assault earlier than expected, perhaps hoping to catch the Marines off guard during the change of watch. Tracer rounds streaked through the gathering dusk as automatic weapons opened up from multiple directions. "Here they come," Sergeant Williams shouted from his position. Multiple targets advancing from the south and east. Maria grabbed her rifle and moved to a defensive position at the rear of the helicopter. Through the failing light, she could see muzzle flashes winking like deadly fireflies among the buildings surrounding their position. The Taliban fighters were advancing in small groups, using cover and concealment to get as close as possible before the final assault. The Marine defense was immediate and devastating. Despite being outnumbered and low on ammunition, the defenders poured accurate fire into the advancing enemy positions. Maria found herself firing alongside Marines who had questioned her presence in their unit just hours earlier. Now, they were depending on her to help hold the line. "RPG," someone shouted, and Maria threw herself flat just as the rocket-propelled grenade exploded against the helicopter's armored hull. Fragments of metal and debris rained down on the defenders, but the aircraft's structure held. The explosion had been close enough to ring Maria's ears, but she was back on her feet and firing within seconds. The battle raged for 20 minutes that felt like hours. Wave after wave of Taliban fighters advanced on their position, only to be driven back by the concentrated fire of the Marine defenders. But Maria could see that their ammunition was running dangerously low, and the enemy seemed to have an endless supply of replacements for their casualties. "I'm down to my last magazine," Morrison called out from his position. Similar reports came from other Marines around the perimeter. They were reaching the point where continuing resistance would become impossible. Maria checked her own ammunition and found that she had less than 30 rounds remaining. At their current rate of fire, they would be out of bullets within minutes. That's when she heard the sound that would save all their lives. The distinctive whoop 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 of approaching helicopters. Not just one aircraft, but several, their engines growing louder by the second. Through the darkness, she could see navigation lights approaching from the north, flying in tight formation. "Extraction is on final approach," Rodriguez announced over the sound of gunfire. "Get ready to move when I give the word." The extraction helicopters came in with their own protective escort. Apache attack helicopters swept the area around the crash site, their 30mm cannons and Hellfire missiles devastating the Taliban positions. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Enemy fire dropped to almost nothing as the surviving fighters scrambled for deeper cover. Two UH-60 transport helicopters touched down simultaneously, their crews immediately jumping out to assist with the evacuation. Maria found herself running toward the nearest aircraft, helping to carry equipment and provide cover for the other Marines. The entire extraction took less than 5 minutes, but it felt like a perfectly choreographed dance of military precision. As her helicopter lifted off from the crash site, Maria looked down at the burning wreckage of their original aircraft. The Black Hawk that had carried them into the mission was now a twisted pile of metal and debris, but it had served as their fortress and lifeline during the most desperate hours of her military career. She looked around at the faces of the Marines in the helicopter with her. Every one of them was looking back at her with expressions she had never seen before. There was gratitude, certainly, but more than that, there was recognition. They were finally seeing her not as an outsider or a burden, but as one of their own. A Marine who had proven herself under the ultimate test. Morrison caught her eye and nodded toward the window. Below them, the lights of Forward Operating Base Bravo were growing larger as they approached their destination. "Almost home, Doc," he said with a tired smile. Home. The word resonated with Maria in a way it never had before. For the first time since joining this unit, she truly felt like she belonged. It had taken 18 hours of hell and the near death of 47 Marines to earn her acceptance, but she had finally found her place among these men. As the helicopter touched down at the base, Maria realized that her real test was just beginning. The events of this day would be thoroughly investigated and analyzed. Reports would be written, medals would be awarded, and careers would be made or broken based on what had happened at that crash site. But more importantly, she would have to learn how to live with her newfound status as a hero. The same Marines who had mocked her that morning would now be telling stories about her courage for years to come. The woman they had called a weak link had become the person who helped hold them all together when everything fell apart. The transformation was complete, but Maria Santos was about to discover that being a hero carried its own unique challenges. The debriefing room at Forward Operating Base Bravo was sterile and fluorescent bright, a sharp contrast to the chaos and darkness Maria had experienced just 12 hours earlier. She sat across from Lieutenant Colonel Henderson, the base commander, while a military investigator took detailed notes of her account. Every few minutes, Henderson would pause to ask for clarification or additional detail about specific events during the mission. "Walk me through the medical triage process again," Henderson requested, his pen poised over a yellow legal pad. "Specifically, how you prioritize treatment when you had multiple casualties arriving simultaneously." Maria had already repeated this information twice, but she understood the importance of accuracy in the official record. Military investigations were thorough by necessity, and her actions during the crisis would be scrutinized by commanders up the chain of command who needed to understand exactly what had happened. Ahmad, the interpreter, was stable but Critical due to infection from his bullet wound, she began again. Jenkins had the head injury and required immediate attention to prevent brain swelling. Morrison's leg wound was serious, but not life-threatening. The shrapnel cases needed surgery, but could wait for evacuation. Henderson nodded and made additional notes. And at no point did you consider leaving any of the wounded behind to improve the chances of the remaining Marines? The question hit Maria like a physical blow. The implication was clear. Had she compromised the mission or endangered other Marines by insisting on treating everyone regardless of their chances of survival? It was a fair question from a tactical standpoint, but it struck at the core of everything she believed about her role as a combat medic. "No, sir," she replied firmly. "Every Marine gets medical treatment. That's not negotiable, even when treating them might compromise the security of the entire unit." Maria looked Henderson directly in the eye. "Especially then, sir. The minute we start deciding which Marines are worth saving and which ones aren't, we stop being Marines." Henderson made a final note and closed his folder. "Thank you, Staff Sergeant Santos. Your account has been consistent with the reports from Captain Rodriguez and the other Marines present. The investigation will be completed within 48 hours, but I wanted you to know that preliminary findings indicate exemplary performance under extreme conditions." As Maria left the debriefing room, she found herself walking through a base that felt completely different from the one she had left 18 hours earlier. Marines who had previously ignored her now stopped to shake her hand or offer words of congratulation. The change was so dramatic that it felt almost surreal. In a mess hall that evening, she found herself sitting at a table surrounded by Marines from her unit. For the first time in 18 months, she wasn't eating alone or enduring hostile stares from across the room. Morrison sat beside her, his wounded leg elevated on a chair, regaling anyone who would listen with stories of her medical skills under fire. Doc had bullets flying all around her, but she never stopped working, he was saying to a group of Marines from another unit. "I swear she was calmer during the firefight than most people are during morning PT." The transformation in Morrison was perhaps the most remarkable of all. The same Marine who had questioned her competence every day for 6 months was now her most vocal supporter. His wounded leg had become a badge of honor, proof that he had been there during the fight and could testify to her courage firsthand. Corporal Jenkins appeared in the mess hall just as Maria was finishing her dinner. His head was wrapped in bandages, and he moved slowly, but the doctors had pronounced his recovery miraculous. The bullet that had creased his skull had missed his brain by less than an inch, and Maria's immediate treatment had prevented fatal brain swelling. "Doc," he said simply, extending his hand. "I owe you my life." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning that went far beyond simple gratitude. Jenkins had been one of her harshest critics, never missing an opportunity to question her presence in the unit. Now he was acknowledging not just her medical skills, but her worth as a Marine and as a person. "Just doing my job," Maria replied, but she shook his hand warmly. "No," Jenkins said seriously. "You went way beyond doing your job. We all know it." Word of the mission spread throughout the base with the speed that only military gossip can achieve. By the next morning, Maria found herself the center of attention wherever she went. Marines who had never spoken to her before were approaching her with questions about combat medicine, requests for advice, and simple expressions of respect. The base commander called her to his office 3 days after the mission to inform her that she was being recommended for the Silver Star, the military's third highest decoration for valor. The recommendation would need approval from higher headquarters, but Henderson made it clear that approval was virtually certain. "Your actions during that mission saved the lives of multiple Marines," Henderson explained. "More than that, your leadership under fire helped hold the entire unit together during a critical situation." Leadership. The word resonated with Maria in ways she hadn't expected. She had never thought of herself as a leader, especially not among Marines who had made it clear they didn't want her there. But during those desperate hours at the crash site, she had indeed taken charge of critical decisions that affected everyone's survival. The recommendation for the Silver Star was accompanied by a promotion to gunnery sergeant, 2 ranks higher than her current position. It was an unprecedented advancement that reflected the military's recognition of her exceptional performance. More importantly, It meant that she would be returning to the United States as a decorated war hero rather than the marginalized outsider she had been when the deployment began. Ahmad, the Afghan interpreter whose rescue had initiated the entire crisis, recovered fully from his wounds and was eventually relocated to the United States with his family. He sent Maria a letter 6 months after the mission, thanking her not only for saving his life, but for demonstrating the best qualities of American military service. His words meant more to her than any official recognition could. The real transformation, however, was in her relationships with her fellow Marines. The unit that had grudgingly tolerated her presence now fought to have her assigned to their missions. Marines who had previously avoided her now sought her out for advice, conversation, and friendship. The change was so complete that new arrivals to the unit couldn't believe stories about how she had been treated before the mission. Morrison, whose leg wound healed completely, became one of her closest friends and most trusted assistants. He often joked that getting shot had been worth it because it taught him not to judge people based on superficial characteristics. The bullet scar on his leg became a reminder of the day he learned the difference between appearance and reality. 6 months later, as Maria prepared to rotate back to the United States, she reflected on the events that had changed everything. The mission that had started as a routine extraction had become a defining moment not just for her, but for everyone involved. 47 Marines had entered that village as a collection of individuals with varying degrees of mutual respect and trust. They had left as a brotherhood forged in combat. The medals and promotions were important, but they weren't what mattered most to Maria. What mattered was that she had finally found her place among the Marines she served with. The acceptance and respect she had earned through 18 hours of hell was worth more than any award or recognition the military could offer. On her last day at Forward Operating Base Bravo, the entire unit gathered in the mess hall for an impromptu farewell ceremony. Morrison presented her with a combat medic patch that had been signed by every Marine who had been at the crash site. Jenkins, fully recovered from his head wound, made a speech that brought tears to Maria's eyes. "Doc Santos taught us something important during that mission," he said to the assembled Marines. "She taught us that courage isn't about being the biggest or the strongest or the loudest. It's about doing what needs to be done when everything is falling apart around you." As Maria boarded the helicopter that would begin her journey home, she looked back at the base that had been her home for 18 months. It was a harsh, dangerous place that had tested her in ways she never could have imagined. But it was also the place where she had discovered who she truly was and what she was capable of accomplishing. The helicopter lifted off into the Afghan sky, carrying her away from the desert battlefield where she had been transformed from an outcast into a hero. But more than that, it was carrying her away from the place where she had finally learned that sometimes the person everyone underestimates turns out to be exactly the person everyone needs. Years later, when young Marines would ask her about that day, Maria would tell them that the real victory wasn't surviving the ambush or saving the wounded. The real victory was proving that courage and competence could overcome prejudice and preconception. It was showing that the measure of a Marine isn't determined by other people's expectations, but by their own willingness to do what's right when it matters most. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos had entered that village as a medic they barely tolerated. She had left as Gunnery Sergeant Santos, a decorated war hero whose courage had saved 47 lives. But most importantly, she had discovered that sometimes being underestimated is the greatest advantage of all, because it means that when you finally prove yourself, the transformation is complete and undeniable. The woman they had called a weak link had become the strongest link in the chain when the chain was under its greatest stress. And in doing so, she had changed not only how others saw her, but how she saw herself. The journey from outcast to hero was complete, but the lessons learned during those 18 hours would last a lifetime. The medals would tarnish, and the promotions would become footnotes in military records, but the bonds forged in combat would endure forever. Maria Santos had finally found her brotherhood, and she had earned it through the currency that Marines respect above all others: courage under fire and absolute dedication to the welfare of her fellow Marines. In the end, that was worth more than all the recognition in the world.